Hello everybody, welcome back to episode 2 of building a DNA250 color. So today we're going to actually get started on it. The very first thing that I typically do is make this little XT60 connector that's going to be attached to the battery contacts on the board right there and right there. So that's generally where I start, and then I continue by attaching the little white connector. I think it's called XSTJH, something like that, connector, to the back of this. So we'll do that after we do the battery connection. So I'm letting my soldering iron get really hot. I've got some wet paper towel here. It's not ideal as far as a full soldering setup or whatever, but for my house, kind of a home setup, it's fine. So I've got it clean and ready to go. We're going to start by tinning these connections. One thing you want to pay attention to these have a little marking on where the positive and the negative goes, so you do not want to mix those up. This says positive is on this side here. I'm trying to get the camera to focus. Positive here on the flat side, negative on the round side. So red is almost always positive when it comes to wiring stuff, so that's what I'm going to do. And we can go on and tin this. I start by getting some flux. On there. And that just kind of coats that with solder. It makes it a little bit easier to keep it together and makes it a little bit faster when it comes to actually attaching it to here. I'm going to get a decent amount of flux on there and put it down in there. I'm going to add some more. And I'm going to keep going until it just looks like a solid connection. There we go. And I just want to point out, this is really hard for me to do on the camera, so I apologize if it looks sloppy, but I'm doing this from an arm's length distance away, so it's very difficult for me to see what I'm doing. And now we're just going to do the same on the negative side. I just tinned this on there, and we're going to attach it to the connector on the negative. Okay, now it looks like we've got a solid connection there. And from here I can just add the little protector that I talked about in the last video. Or I can heat shrink it and then add it. So that protects the solder joints. So I'm going to take a quick pause really quick, and then we'll start on the chip itself. Alright, so it's actually the next day from the stuff that I filmed yesterday, because during my little break I remembered that there's a couple things in what you need to do this build that I totally forgot to mention, so I actually had to go get them. The first one is this is 26 gauge speaker wire. You need just a little bit of this to wire the firing button, the momentary switch, so you have to have this, and I totally forgot to mention that yesterday. And this one is optional, but heat shrink tubing. This is a pack that comes with a bunch of different sizes, and I think this came from Harbor Freight. Either Harbor Freight or Home Depot, but it's definitely cheaper at Harbor Freight. So yeah, I used just a little bit of this, one of these sizes, to go on and heat shrink the connections that we made yesterday, or if you're watching this a couple minutes ago or whatever. So yeah, I went on and heat shrinked these connections, and then I'm going to put the little protector thing back on there. It just makes it a lot more clean, and nothing's going to get up in there and touch those contacts. These things are kind of hard to snap on there. There we go. So yeah, that's good, and I like to leave myself quite a bit of length there, because the enclosure that you're doing it on and the battery that you're using is really going to make a difference as far as how long this needs to be, if it needs to go upwards inside the enclosure and bend back down, or go underneath. And I'll show that a little bit more when I'm about to decide how long to cut this. I'll kind of do a little mock-up again and see what it looks like with the battery in there. So I like to give myself some room to maneuver there by making these long enough. I also went to get my trusty little head visor thing. This thing has been around for so long. I've done so many wire builds and electronics and woodworking and resin and all the stuff with these, so this is absolutely worth the price if you do any of that kind of stuff. For me, I need these to be able to see little tiny things that I'm doing. So yeah, I'm going to put those on and hopefully be able to see a little bit better what I'm doing than yesterday, because that was crazy trying to solder at arm's length away, and yeah, I'm going to try and make it a little bit easier this time. Okay, so now it comes to soldering the actual board. So I'm going to go on and plug in my soldering iron so that it can be heating up. I apologize for all those damn bird noises. There's like birds camping out right outside my door and right outside my window. They just like camp there and just sing all the time, and it drives me crazy. It'll be 3 in the morning and they're singing, just being annoying as hell. Okay, so the soldering iron is heating up right now. And what I'm going to do is start by doing all of these pads. So here's the battery pads and the positive and negative 510 pad. And then we're also going to do these, but I'm not going to to tin those, and I'll show that in just a second. You only really have one chance to do this unless you have like a solder extractor and all of that kind of stuff. It ends up being a nightmare to try and remove that if you mess it up. So I'm going to try not to mess that up because I don't have a solder extractor. I'm going to start with the 510, just get a little bit of flux. And now I'm going to do this positive pad, the one on the right there. Just get a little bead on there. Okay, that's a little bit sloppy, but that should work. Now I've put flux onto the negative pad. There we go. I've got them both on there. And obviously you want to make sure they're not touching. And now I'm going to do the same for the battery contacts. Looks like a little bit of solder dripped onto my board, so hopefully it didn't burn it. I apologize, I have to do these off camera just so I don't mess them up. There we go. I got both kind of bubbles on there. I just laid it on there and it should just fill in. So these ended up looking a little bit messy because I'm trying to do them on camera, but yeah, these look clean, and now there's just a little puddle of solder there waiting for the wire to be added into it. Okay, next up is the balancing taps. And for me, this is generally the hardest thing that I'm going to solder as far as the chip is concerned. If you look at the internals of my existing DNA250 color, it'll let you know just to double check that this is oriented the right way. If you can see, there's a little slot there, so there's one direction that the plug can go in there. You definitely do not want to turn this around, otherwise it's just all going to be messed up. And like I said, you only really have one chance to do this particular piece, so you want to make sure that this little slot is pointing downwards. So it needs to go in like that into those little holes there. But first I'm going to put flux on all of these separate connections. Okay, so I've got flux on all of them there. And I'm going to insert it into those holes at the bottom there, right where my thumb is, making sure that it's oriented the right way. Push it all the way in. And as you can see, there's still flux on the tip there. So this is going to be super hard for me to do on camera, so I'm probably going to end up doing this off camera. But what I'm going to do is just tap each little leg until flux pulls around it because of the, solder pulls around it. It's going to follow where the flux is. So you kind of lay the solder onto it and it just fills in each little pad. And obviously you want to make sure that you're not touching more than one at once so they don't jump over each other or whatever. You need to do this with just a little bit of solder. Okay, so I had to do that off camera. It's just too small to try and do from a distance. So as you can see, they all three look pretty well on there. There's solder on the pin itself and then just a little bit of a pull around it, touching that contact, so it's now secure in there. And obviously we're going to be double checking once we get the battery contacts on there that those connections are secure and that they're correct. Okay, so the next thing is to put the battery taps on there. That's here and here. If you look, the board is labeled battery negative, battery positive. So it's right above that white thing printed on the PCB. So the red wire is going to connect here, the black wire is going to connect here. So the way that you want to orient this depends on your enclosure and the design that you're trying to do with the battery. You can have it oriented downwards like this if you have a lot of space underneath there, or you can have it oriented upwards and kind of bend it down, which is probably what I'm going to end up doing. So I'm going to do a quick mock-up like I did yesterday by putting the chip into the enclosure, with the battery. I'm going to try and have this plugged in here, and then imagine where this would be. So with this, I'm going to have to be long enough to bend up and back down. So probably right about here is where I'm going to cut and bend it up and back down. So I'll cut about this much off of there, and that should leave me plenty of room. And then strip the wires. And now we're doing the same thing that we did earlier with tinning these wires when we tinned the other side of them. Okay, now that we've got them both tinned, we can kind of plan out for putting them onto the chip itself. I try and lay them horizontal, as close as I can to horizontal. You don't want to kind of put them like this, sticking outwards. So you're going to end up having a lot of pressure on the wire, on that solder joint if you do that. So I try and do as close as I can to horizontal, only one at a time. I'm going to do the positive first and try not to kind of burn this plastic there. Sorry for being off camera for a second there. So I'm going to try and lay it up against there with some flux on it and just kind of melt them together. One thing I want to point out, you need to avoid this screw right there when you're doing the negative. That screw is going to hold the chip onto the 3D printed piece, so if you have this wire running right over it, it's going to make it a lot harder. Okay, so these are definitely not the best joints that I've ever made, but they should be fit on there okay. And there's some room underneath this wire to get that screw in. So this should give me enough room to turn this upside down. Okay, so now the next step is going to be to test this chip. We do that by carefully putting the screen on and plugging the battery in and seeing what happens. This is a little ribbon cable. If you've ever taken apart a cell phone, you'll recognize these held on by a little clip there. Just be very careful with that clip. And it kind of just slides in there carefully and locks into place. There it is with it locked into place there. And so now the screen is active. You want to be careful not to bend this. Okay, so now we should be able to plug this in and it should turn on. Hey, it turns on. Okay, so that means that we soldered everything correctly so far. Now we just have to do the firing switch and the 510 positive and negative, and that is it on the soldering. I'm going to unplug the battery. And take the screen off carefully. This little clip here is super fragile, so always be careful with that. Okay, so I'm going to try and put a little diagram up on the screen to show all the different pieces of the 250 color. These two little tiny holes right here are the firing button, positive and negative. It's a little bit different layout than the DNA250, which had them all next to each other and they were marked. But yeah, these are now a separate little area for the firing switch, and then positive, negative for both the up, down, and I think select. I'm not sure how that works on here because I've never used these. So I know on the DNA250 there was positive, negative for the two buttons if you wanted to do custom buttons, but we're not doing that. We're using the buttons that are on here. So it's pretty unusual to have custom buttons on mods. They pretty much all use the little tactile buttons that are already on the chip, with the exception of the firing switch, which is what we're doing. So we need to use that little speaker cable wherever it went. Okay, so I've got the speaker cables ready, separated apart, and this is going to be for the firing switch. And now I'm going to strip them. And I'll go on and strip them on both sides. So soldering this is basically the same as soldering the balance taps. They're little tiny wires that you want to be careful with. I'm going to put them inside the chip and do one at a time. And try and use as little solder as possible to get that sealed on there. Okay, so now that hole is totally covered and it is sealed on there, but I'll be able to cut off the excess there. So I'm going to cut that off. Now you can see there it's filled up, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. Got that ready to go. Alright, and I got that one sealed up too. Those look pretty clean, and I'll be able to cut this flush. Okay, clean the flux off of there. Those look like a pretty neat joints there. So now what I'm going to do is put it all back together again and test out this firing button. And I'll just skip through that. You saw me do it once. Okay, now that I've got it all plugged back together again, as you can see, the firing button is still working. And now I can test that this is working by touching these two together. I'm trying to do it so you can see. It just locked. That was me tapping it 5 times. So now it's saying check atomizer because I'm holding these two pieces together. That's essentially what's happening with the switch, is it's touching them together. So this works, and it's ready to be attached to a switch. I'm going to unplug it all. Alright, so that is the bulk of the soldering that needs to be done on this. The only thing that's left to do is the positive and negative lines for the 510. and that's all the soldering, and the rest is just assembly. So we're going to stop at this point. In the next episode, we're going to put these positive and negative on there, and then hopefully start to put it together. So I will see you on the next episode.